Hi, everyone. I'm Michael Gonzalez. I'm the Executive Director for the Institute of American Constitutional Thought and Leadership. The Institute is a new school within a school at the University of Toledo. We offer courses, degree programs, scholarships, and study abroad opportunities for the UT community, but a core part of our mission is also to provide public programs like today's talk. Now, before we hear from our speaker, I'd like to announce two new opportunities now being offered by the Institute to UT students. The first is a study abroad trip to Oxford University that will take place this summer from July 12th to August 9th. The Institute's faculty will be taking 10 undergraduates to Pembroke College, where we will study the Anglo-American natural rights tradition, discussing political thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Edmund Burke, and William Blackstone. To apply, students should pick up one of our flyers in the back, so if you know a University of Toledo student, or if you are one, please take a flyer. Students who are selected for this program will receive a full scholarship to attend, so their flights will be covered, as well as their lodging and their meals while they're there. The second opportunity I'd like to announce is a new pair of degree programs that we are going to be offering. The Institute now offers a minor in Constitutional Studies and a minor in Engineering Leadership. The minor in Constitutional Studies provides focused study of the American constitutional tradition, the skills of statesmanship, and the ideas that drive current debates. Students in this program will take courses in rhetoric and civic discourse, in democratic citizenship, and our unique model U.S. Senate course, where students study the U.S. Senate and then reenact historical Senate debates. The minor in Engineering Leadership brings engineering students into working relationships with leaders in applied science, business, and government, while engaging only the best in the humanities that has been written about the relationship between democracy and technology. In addition to these new travel and study opportunities, the Institute is also rolling out new scholarships, extracurricular activities, mentorship programs, and even more. So please stay tuned. That's our brief infomercial for today, and I'm now happy to introduce our speaker, Clark Judge. Clark Judge served as speechwriter and special assistant to both President Ronald Reagan and Vice President George H.W. Bush. He also was a member of the Moscow Summit speechwriting team and was lead writer for the Toronto Economic Summit in 1988 and helped shape the White House approach to the 1988 presidential campaign. Mr. Judge is the founder and managing director of the White House Writers Group. He is board chairman of the California-based Pacific Research Institute and board member of the Eisenhower Foundation. He has written extensively on U.S. politics, the international financial crisis, healthcare reform, global economics, and global security issues. His writings have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, New York Times, National Review, the Claremont Review of Books, and other publications. And most recently, I think on Sunday, in fact, Clark was interviewed by Fox News for his opinion on President Trump's speech to Congress. So I encourage you to take a look at that. Please join me in welcoming Clark Judge.
You used to have to speak loudly. Now I can just whisper and you can hear me still. I've been asked to talk today about Ronald Reagan, and particularly about the Tear Down This Wall speech. So the importance, we now think of that as sort of the signature speech, one of the signature speeches of the Reagan presidency. But in fact, at the time it was given, it was in many places dismissed as, well, that'll never happen. Once the wall did come down, the importance of it became universally recognized, because one thing we in White House speechwriting had a sense, I certainly did in any event, was that as the Soviet Union became clearly more wobbly, when we put down markers, they started looking at how to pick them up, how to expand their, move away from at least the Gorbachev faction within the Soviet Union, how to move away from the oppressiveness of Stalinism and post-Stalinism, how to develop relationships that and start to loosen their ties to the Warsaw Pact. They were very ambivalent about this, and in fact, when the wall did come down, it was almost by an accident, but that accident reflected the change in mindset in that in the whole Soviet bloc. There was a lot of protest in East Berlin at the time, and in fact throughout Eastern Europe, and a lot of movement towards how do we. The people were clearly feeling like that communism had to end. In the period after I left the White House, spent some time in Los Angeles on a project, and my wife and I took out somebody we had met who was a prior
You're good. We're just turning you off back here a little bit.
yeah, I feel like I'm moving into another realm. Had been a Polish dissident, and we were talking about the impact of Reagan's speeches, which I heard, my colleagues heard over and over again later, that the speeches of Ronald Reagan, the speeches we had written, were what helped the dissidents stay together, stay focused, gave a sense of hope. So what I'm saying to you is that there was something broad moving. We were involved in it in many ways. What we were saying there, President Reagan was asked in the latter days of his presidency, the CIA came out with another report given to the president that said the Soviet Union will never fall, it's going to be strong. And his response to it in private was he didn't believe it, it was out of line with the human spirit, and he was right. And by saying that, the human spirit was energized all through the Soviet bloc. So when the leaders or men in charge or dictators really in East Germany started to have problems, and they couldn't. There was so much sort of breaking away, and they didn't feel they could be as oppressive as they had been prior. When there was a big meeting, and one of them came out of the meeting and was asked by the press what's going on, and he made some remark that was interpreted as we're opening the wall, but he didn't mean that. But it was conveyed through news to the guards at the wall, who then opened the wall. So in a sense, that's about that there's a certain justice in that, because the people of Germany, the people of Hungary, the people all through the Soviet bloc were finding that we're starting to stand up to communism. And that was because we had set the standard and also put a spotlight on, which they found the Soviets and their allies no longer felt they could go in and murder and do the other things they did to hold populations in line. So this is where the Berlin Wall fits as the most important of the Berlin Wall speech fits, tear down this wall fits. The most important of those many speeches that the president gave, talking about a life beyond communism, talking about the promise of freedom, talking about the failures of not observing and not honoring the human spirit. Now, how did this speech come to be written? Well, the president was to, this is 86, the president was to go to an annual event which was called the Economic Summit. Now, at that time, the 7 or 8, it depended, 7 industrial countries major industrial countries, the members of the EU, the United States, Canada, and Japan, major members of the EU, Germany, Italy, France. These countries their leaders would get together once a year and discuss international issues and negotiate and do other things of that sort. In this year, it was to be in Venice. Venice wasn't too far from the Soviet Union, and where things had evolved. We had had this successful re-election. The Soviets had started picking up the markers where we put them down for how to reform. The very fact of the American economy taking off so strongly under the Reagan reforms made a huge impression on both Western Europe and Eastern Europe and the Soviet bloc. And so it seemed the right time to go to Berlin. We had had major opposition to us in the first term, riots and all in Germany. Those had gone away. That whole faction, which was basically backed by the Soviets, was no longer operative, effective. It didn't draw support, and so the president was to go to Berlin, make a visit to Berlin, and he was to give a speech there. A colleague of mine named Peter Robinson, if you was assigned the speech. If you've some of you may know of a streamed show on from the Hoover Institution called Uncommon Knowledge. Peter has been the moderator of that show, the interviewer. It's an interview show for several decades now. He's pretty well known among many parts of college, many college students, less so among people of our restrained age. But at least I'll be restrained about what I'll estimate as our ages. So Peter was sent on what is called the pre-advance. Now, any presidential trip has three. It's really three trips. There's a planning trip called the pre-advance, then an advance trip where all the details of a presidential visit, some of them are security, but it gets down to what to serve at a reception, where the cameras will be if he's giving a speech, those sorts of things. What might be the interest of the people in local and national, in addition to what you learn from the normal diplomatic and political environment. What might be particularly interested in hearing from the president? Excuse me a second. Peter was sent on the pre-advance. Very unusual, by the way. Normally a pre-advance did not have a speechwriter. However, it was widely understood within the White House this was a big moment. This was the president's first trip here. There was the confrontation with the Soviets that had run all through his presidency. And so Peter's goes to Berlin, and his first stop is with the senior American diplomat in Berlin. Now, the part of writing a speech is touching base with the various centers of policy in the U.S. government, a speech for the president. So if you're writing on welfare reform, you talk to the people who deal with that in the White House, but you also talk to people in the agencies, in the departments about it. You get a feeling for where the administration and the government are, and where you should know as a matter of course on almost every issue where that will be intuitively, but it's important to touch base with the people who are actually doing the work. And so Peter's first stop was to the senior American diplomat in Berlin. Distinguished Foreign Service officer who later took credit for the Tear Down This Wall speech, claimed to have written it at one point, became ambassador to Berlin under Clinton. And they sat down and he said, well, the first thing is you don't mention the wall. This is the man who later took credit for that. Welcome to the government, by the way. And to politics, and to Washington. Such an inspiring place. But in any event, he said, don't mention the wall. Berliners are used to the wall. They don't want things stirred up. Germans generally think of Reagan as a cowboy. They won't, they'll just dismiss this right away. You shouldn't mention the wall. Now, I will say that the White House had already, discussion in the White House had already started to settle on calling something about the wall. We weren't quite sure what at that point. And, but he was saying don't mention it at all. And certainly don't call for the tearing down of it. Too disruptive. Now, in any, I say that you touch base with the government, but you also, there are other groups, like, what do people in Berlin think? He said they don't care about the wall. You hear this kind of thing from diplomats a lot, I will say. And he said they don't care about the wall. That evening, Peter went to a dinner party. We had about 12, 13, 14 people. They were, he had gone to, we heard about Oxford earlier. He was, had one of the Oxford scholarships as a student and spent a couple of years there. And one of his friends had recommended a couple who had worked at the International Monetary Fund, a German couple, and returned to Germany to retire. Peter, there was an introduction and they set up this dinner party, and it was made up of, any of you could have been in there. Academics, lawyers, doctors, business people, friends, well-educated, very concerned about, interested in local affairs, foreign affairs, and they mingled at the beginning, and then as they sat down for dinner, he said, and the discussion began, the general discussion began. He said, well, he talked about the senior diplomat he'd met that day and his advice, and he said, what do you think about the wall? There was silence in the room. And then one of the men at the end of the table said, my sister lives 25 miles to the east. I haven't seen her since the wall went up. What do you think I think about that wall? And another man said, I walk to work each day. I pass a guard tower. There's a young man in that tower. I know he speaks the same language I speak. I know he has a heritage that I have. He's holding an AK-47, which was the standard Soviet rifle, military rifle. And I think this is a zoo, but I don't know who the animal is and who the zookeeper is. And then the woman who was the hostess of the evening said, if Mr. Gorbachev is really serious about this reform and restructuring, which the Russian words were glasnost and perestroika, if he's really serious about this, he'll come here and he'll get rid of that wall. So Peter took this back to the United States, to the White House, and sat down and did a first draft, and worked out the call for tearing down this wall. It was clear he thought about it. The chief speechwriter, Tony Dolan, who was the author of the Evil Empire speech, thought about it. They were discussing it. There was a general discussion about it. And it was clear, how could Ronald Reagan go to Berlin and not call for tearing down the wall? And how would he wouldn't even consider not going. We didn't have to consult the president on this because the president's views were so well known, the firmness of his convictions were so evident all through the presidency that the consultation wasn't required at that point. This is what he would want, and this is what was required of us as Americans to do. So they went back and forth on the particular phrasing of the call. At one point, one draft had it in German, like John Kennedy's Ich ein Berliner, I am a Berliner, which he gave it his big address in Berlin to a vast crowd. By the way, there was a slight misuse of language there. It was the standard joke of that time that saying Berliner in the sense of a resident or a citizen of Berlin is not Berliner in German. In German, Berliner is, he said, I am a Berliner. In Germany, the word Berliner means jelly donut. So the question is, when he said, Ich ein Berliner, were people cheering for freedom or for lunch? But obviously that was a big moment, and this was a very small trip up, which I'm sure got some smiles, but was remembered fondly and inspiringly within Berlin. But in any event, they tried that, they tried different ways of phrasing it, and finally came down, the point of Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall is it was so simple and direct. And that's where they settled. So, and the tearing it to perestroika and glasnost put a whole framework on it. Well, so the draft is prepared. Now in the White House, in our White House certainly, speeches didn't go directly to the president, although ultimately this one did. Speeches are staffed out. In fact, more than ultimately, this one did. Every part of the government that might have an interest, a policy interest, in this case it was pretty much confined to state and the certain offices at state, but every element of the government that has a policy interest gets a chance to look at a draft speech and weigh in. This often leads to a lot of comments that are contradictory to one another. One office says one thing, another says another. In this case, it might be the National Security Council says one thing, state says another, defense says another. But in any event, one of the roles of a speechwriter is not just to write, but to mediate these and negotiate these differences, so that the president receives something that is consistent with what he would want, which is what the speechwriter's position in any, at least in the Reagan White House was. You have to know where the president wants to go, and even if you haven't consulted with him directly, and you have to defend that position, which was often disputed by members of the different parts of the government. So this goes into a lot of, this is about to go into staffing the draft. First, in a very unusual, the president saw it before anybody else did. And the president, we had a meeting with the president, and at the meeting, we discussed a number of speeches and briefed him on a number of speeches. And he said, Peter explained that if the atmospheric conditions were right, the speech would be heard as far east as Moscow. On radio, did the president have anything he wanted to say before this went into staffing? The president said, well, actually, I'll give you a bad Reagan imitation now. Well, that line about the wall, it should stand. Very simple, very firm. And what he was basically saying is, there's going to be a fight, and your job is to hold the line. And I'll back you up, but you need to hold the line. Now that may sound strange. Why doesn't he just? The State Department had started coming back with drafts that had new material, but didn't include the line. And Peter and the communications head in the White House, a guy named Tom Griscom, now is, last I saw, was editor or publisher of a newspaper in Tennessee, which is where he was from. He was with the, had come to Washington from there. They worked out, what can we give state? What do we, we're going to protect that line, but what can we give them? And this is part of presidential speechwriting that people don't generally think of. You're doing a lot of negotiation. People may not want something, or they want something added. Should you add something? Could you? And so if you read the speech now, what you'll find is it's two speeches in a sense. The opening of it, the first half of it, builds up to the call, tear down this wall. The rest is basically diplomatic business. We're doing this, we're doing that, let's do this, let's do that. And those were the things that were given to them. And the placing of the call was critical because the speech was defined by that. It wasn't defined by diplomatic minutiae. It was defined by the first half of the speech. And so it goes in, and state keeps coming back, and they try to give state as much as they can, but they hold firm on that. This is Peter and Tom. They hold firm on the core, and it finally comes to Schultz, Secretary of State Schultz, George Schultz, going into the Oval Office. Well, George, I don't think that's going to happen. They kept at it. I mentioned that there was a economic summit. It was in Venice, as I said, and that means you get to stay in beautiful places. And they were in the presidential compound. There was in a Venetian palace, and he, surrounding and beautiful gardens. And he the day before the speech, he's in the summit is over, and he's making notes and doing some things on normal business in the garden of this palace. And traveling with him is the Deputy Chief of Staff, soon to be Chief of Staff, Ken Duberstein. And Ken comes up to him and says, Mr. President, states come back again on that Berlin Wall speech. They really want the line out. And he looks up at him and he says, well, Ken, I am the president, aren't I? He says, yes, sir, yes, sir. We're all agreed on that. And that does mean I get to make these decisions, doesn't it? Yes, sir. Well, it stays in. And in the car on the way to Brandenburg Gate, he slapped Ken on the knee and he said, the boys at State are going to kill me for this, but it's the right thing to do. That's the story. And as I say, actually, the initial responses of German press, of European press, was dismissive, more or less as the diplomat had predicted. It was dismissive every place but in Moscow, and in the halls of power in Eastern Europe, where it had created a great deal of increasing confusion and increasing divisions on where among the communist elite on where they could go, should go. They knew that their economies were collapsing. What could they do? And in a sense, the day that the wall opened, it opened because all that confusion, as I said, led to the people having the sense of direction, the sense of asserting their spirit, and the oppressors in confusion, not knowing how to respond because they were facing the human spirit. So that's the story of the Berlin Wall speech. And once the wall fell, it was clear there was a sort of competition in that period, among us any event, for meaning the speechwriters, although the president had left office by the time the wall fell. There was a sense of which was the greatest of Reagan's speeches. And once the Berlin Wall fell, there was no question. That was it. So I'd be happy to take some questions, and I hope that's my story. What were states' specific objections? Basically, this is too confrontational. This is, nobody's going to believe it. It won't have any effect. All you're doing is stirring things up, that sort of thing. And from a diplomat's point of view, that's probably pretty much how it was in the diplomatic corps. It wasn't among the people. The state wasn't particularly good at that. And it was also, a certain bureaucratic resistance to changes in the status quo. So those are the objections. As I say, there was a lot of diplomatic business that got put in the second half of the speech, but that was states' champion insistence on that was pretty standard. We want to mention this, we want to mention that, but also pretty standard. No sense of the broader public and of the really sense of the broader moment outside of diplomatic corps. Okay, go ahead.
Well, I was wondering if there was at all a way in which State Department was still clinging to détente, so the idea of
well, that would be part of it. Détente was, which was the kind of peaceful coexistence of the Soviets, and it was still sort of a factor, certainly was, but look, remember, at that time, Soviet Union was partly, maybe even largely as a result of Reaganist policies, which had to do with no longer subsidizing the Soviet Union, which in various ways we had done over the years, allowing certain kinds of trade, certain kinds of, no longer that kind of propping up, some of it not perceived as popping up, but even within our government, but sort of buying peace. Stopping that, directly appealing to the people of Eastern Europe and people of the world, all of that had created, various monetary things, the buildup, the arms buildup, SDI, what we now call, I guess, is now Iron Dome or whatever, which was dismissed within, particularly by the Democratic Party in Congress, was dismissed as, fanciful, impossible, never can happen, and probably shouldn't. All of that had forced the Soviet Union into a position of being in economic trouble. They had, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, they had put big investments into a first strike capacity, nuclear strike, and they had other investments too. They had also, of course, in the late Carter years, they had invaded Afghanistan, with, which was a big money sink for them. The movement, the SDI itself was a kind of a money sink for them, though we hadn't spent a penny on it at that point, but it had the capacity of making their first strike capacity obsolete. Now, I'll say one detail about that. The critics in the United States, in Democrats in Congress and all, said, well, you can never have a perfect shield, something that we're closer to now, as the Israelis have demonstrated in the attacks on Israel with their Iron Dome. But at that time, that was basically true. But you didn't need to have a perfect protection to end a country, the Soviet Union's first strike capacity. First strike meant they would hit so hard and so fast that they would wipe out our capacity to retaliate in any serious way. Now, we had the ability to respond very quickly, as everyone knows, but there was still this question of everything has to get through, because their first strike would be an attack on our nuclear, our ability to respond to a nuclear attack. And SDI would make that instantly, however, even if it was not perfect, instantly obsolete, that assumption. Soviets were willing to take more casualties than we were, but they were not willing to go into something that they were very frightened that their whole, what was it, 63 to 83, 20-year attempt to develop a first strike would be obsolete almost immediately. They were also confronting that this is as Silicon Valley was becoming very dominant in the American economic scene. It also was a big threat to the Soviets. They didn't have the capacity to match us in those technologies, which had tremendous impact on the ability to take us on in any form at all. They were basically still working with World War II technology, to some extent, which we've seen them in the Ukraine. A lot of what they've been doing in the Ukraine is not that different than what the Soviet forces were doing in World War II. The Ukrainians have had all the drones and all. Now the Soviets have got them from others, or rather the Russians have. But all of these were making the Soviet Union more and more fragile economically and with implications on security. You may recall that one of the critical moments in the fall of the Soviet Union was when, this is much after the speech, when the miners in a particular area struck. And they just strike that had never been done before of this kind. And what was the issue in the strike? Was it wages? No. It was soap. They couldn't get soap to clean themselves after each day. It was making life. We think of that, how would that be? But you think of somebody going down in a mine and he comes up the next day and he goes down again and he's basically becoming closer and closer to being a serf. And this was just, this led to, and it came at just a moment when the Soviet Union was teetering. So all of these were pressures that were being put on them. I'll give you another example of making their military commitment obsolete. You remember when the Titanic was found? Do you remember when they went down and found it for the first time and all the news? Does everybody remember that? That was it wasn't advertised or presented at the time as having a military involvement. But it was done by Woods Hole, which is basically a research lab for the Navy. And the purpose of it, I heard this from John Lehman, who was our Secretary of the Navy. The purpose of it was to demonstrate to the Soviets how advanced our underwater capacities were, and to make it clear to them that they could never catch up. So this is another area where they're again feeling, this was early in the presidency, but this is another area. In many, many areas, there were pressures being put on them, demonstrations to be made to them to, if there was anybody in the Kremlin saying, we ought to go after those Americans, having others say, no, you shouldn't. And so it comes to, and at the same time, appeals both through the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, the speeches of the president, and various other kinds of fora, the reassertion of the belief in freedom, and the example of the United States economy growing so rapidly in that time, and the new technologies that were coming on. All of these ultimately persuaded the Soviets that their hopes for conquest, if you will, for victory, were futile. And just before, I think it was, I read some minutes of the Politburo. I think it was just before the Reykjavik, but it may have been just before Geneva, the Geneva summit, which was the first of the summits. The Soviets, we had by then, whether it was Soviet stuff or things we had sort of bugged them on, had bugs in the room. Gorbachev said, we have got to, I think it was Reykjavik, he said, we have got to get them to back off of SDI, the missile defense, or else we'll fall. So all of these things were coming together at once. It was the culmination of a set of policies that Reagan brought with him into office. There's recently been a book that said that Reagan didn't have a strategy and it was all because of Gorbachev. That is absolutely wrong. This was the culmination of all those policies, and the call to tear down this wall became the linchpin of this. And one thing I have become much more aware of than I was at the time. There are times when if you say something, people can imagine it. And if you don't say it, they can't. And Reagan said it, and everybody, the permanence of that wall ended in the popular imagination. And the idea that it could come down dominated after that. Does that answer your question? Short answer, I know.
Speech writing under Reagan appears to have been a very rigorous process. How do you think that compares to speechwriter in today's administration?
I think actually this is a pretty strong administration in terms of its speech writing. The speech we saw the other day to Congress was an outstanding speech. That didn't happen by accident. It was well researched. They had spent lots of time picking out people that framed their cases. His State of the Union addresses during his first term, if you go back and look at them, every one of them, he walks into a Congress where the Democrats, who dominated more at that time, are ready to jeer him, boo him, and whatever. And he has them. You may recall one where he said something that had the whole room erupt into applause. One of the reasons they were so quiet this last time is the leadership had said no applause. Those kinds of speeches have always been very good, and I know the people who both who advise them and some of them, and I think they're very good. I do think there have been presidencies where it hasn't been good. The one that comes most to mind is the Obama presidency, where there were simple factual mistakes, like I think he got the Declaration of Independence wrong at some point, and you sort of wonder what's going on here. But that isn't to say that the Obama people had bad speeches. They didn't. He was a good speaker. Biden is something else anyway. But I'll tell you something about speech writing. I think of presidential speechwriters and speechwriters, presidential speaking styles in terms of music, at least from Reagan to Trump. Reagan's symphonic, all the elements of tone, nuance, subtlety of meaning, rising, inspiring, all that, everything. He was a full orchestra in himself. I wrote for George H.W. Bush before Reagan. Rock and roll. Simple driving beats. Bill Clinton. Well, think of Bill Clinton's on the stump. Bill Clinton on the stump. It's like Hank Williams' Jambalaya. Hello, Joe, we gotta go. Me, oh my, oh, gotta go. Isn't my voice terrific? Good time music. We're gonna have some fun, which somebody told me is what he told women too. But his other style, in his State of the Union addresses, in his second inaugural, which is when this second style occurred to me, it's a lot like improvisational jazz. It's each of the sets, each of the sections is brilliant. Doesn't necessarily line up with another section, but each is brilliant. It has a kind of spontaneity. It has a kind, and in fact, when I said this in front of one of his speechwriters, he said, "Well, you know, we called them riffs." In other words, that's how they thought about it too. George W. Bush, he's country music. Very strong structure, note of evangelical lyricism. You know, what did somebody say about country music? It's a gun, a God, and mom. But he didn't necessarily have all of that. But he had actually the evangelical lyricism was important. And that's very much like country music. Barack Obama, urban jazz in his formal addresses. Those long pauses, that's Miles Davis. Now, this is something I've been saying for about 10 years, these comparisons. I went to a dinner about 3 months ago that was all the various speechwriters, groups of speechwriters from all the administrations going back to where there's still speechwriters. So Truman's people were there, and one or two, Eisenhower. You get the idea. And each had somebody stand up and say something. And the Obama person stood up and said, he kept writing for him, would keep asking for pauses, and he sat down with me and said, "Think of Miles Davis." So I thought afterwards, gosh, how did I get that one right? Donald Trump. Now, as I said, his State of the Union's formal addresses, look at what he did in Poland when he went there just after he became president in his first term. These substantive speeches are really fantastic, deep and very well done. But think of his rallies. Think of he'll go from a clear period of talking about policy, and then he'll go into these kind of hypnotic waves of repetition, whatever. The clear periods are sort of like melodies, and the hypnotic waves. I think some people here will know this reference. That's the Grateful Dead. If you think of a Deadhead concert, first of all, the rallies are just like Deadhead concerts. Does everybody know what the Grateful Dead were as a group? And they had these huge concerts, and people would plug in, and it was very participatory. And if you listen to their music, it goes from melody to kind of hypnotic waves and back to melody. That's very much the style, the current president's manner on the stump, and in portions of other kinds of speeches. But that's the stump style. So all of them have different styles. I would say, whether it's President Trump or any of the others, that I could make fun of them and say, well, they didn't do it quite as well as we did, and that sort of thing. But each, in a way, brought a kind of artistry to speaking and to speech giving, which their speechwriters picked up. I won't say that of President Biden, because I really think he was deficient in a lot of ways. He was just sort of angry and accusatory. But I would say that of everybody else. The Democrats, Republicans, each of those men was an artist in his way.
How many years did you have the honor of working for President Reagan?
Well, I was a volunteer in the Reagan campaign in '79. And after I was in New York City, and after that, I after we won the primary in New York, I was involved in a project that I was the pen on, if you will, the writer, of surveying urban policies. And I wrote what became the urban policy of the first of the campaign and then of the administration. I formally joined the administration in early '82, so they'd been in office for a year, as in a volunteer position, as you know, the Elon Musk exercise now in government control, spending and waste and all. There was one for Reagan called the Grace Commission, and I was on the staff. One of the differences evident is that Musk, you recalled the other day at the speech the other day to Congress, the President went through all the people who were 120 years old and at least the names were still on the Social Security rolls. We couldn't have done that. You could only do that with current IT, okay, information technology. You can do searches and pull that out. We couldn't have done that. But we did do a lot of things that were, I was on the, basically a kind of pre-advance of blocking out where the big issues were. And I was hired before the full work began, hired into another position. We couldn't have, the sort of thing we did that was effective may seem simple, but I was working on the Department of Education task force, and we were told, as were others in other parts of the government, that you know, there was no way of, you could walk around, nobody knew where to send, if they'd borrowed money from the government, student loans or FHA loans, nobody knew where to, had a central place to send it to. The checks, so somebody said to us, well, you can walk around this place and just stop in every office. Do you have a check today? And pick up $1 million. So we set up lock boxes like a bank, and one of the lock boxes knew exactly how much money was to come in, except that twice as much came in and nobody knew where it was coming from. So these were sort of early effort, energized and made possible by current technology. I was hired to do urban policy from there, and then about 6 months after that, I was hired away to do international economic policy. So we're talking from '82 on. And in early '84, I was hired to be the vice president's, one of his speechwriters at the beginning of the '84 campaign. 2.5 years later, I was hired to join the president's staff, and that was also 2.5 years. So 5 years of White House of speechwriting, and another period of more than a year, 2 years really, of other things. So, you're.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.